Hey there, I'm just a guy having fun at the range. Today we're off the range to work on some dry practice. So let's build those dry practice skills. Once you've mastered the basic manipulations with your firearm in dry practice, you can start to use dry practice to hone some of the other skills involved with marksmanship. Of course, the primary skills that you want to be focusing on in dry practice are going to be your trigger press and other manipulations of your firearm. You can also use dry practice to work on presentation as well as malfunction clearing. Let's talk about dry practice for malfunctions. Now, in a semi-automatic firearm, we typically have 3 malfunctions that we want to practice. A type 1, where we thought that we loaded a round, and when we squeeze the trigger, there's a click and no bang. Okay, that's what we call a type 1 malfunction. Now, our typical clearing for that type 1 malfunction is to reseat the magazine and flip and rack to make sure that a round goes into the chamber. We can practice that with a dry firearm, and in fact, it's good to practice it with a dry firearm. So again, I'm going to start pointed into the target this time, and I'm going to go ahead and line up my sights and get a good dry press. Don't ever waste a dry press. It's good practice. You can always use it to make your trigger press just a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and press that trigger, and I'll get a click. Now that is my symptom that I need to fix. Now, yes, that's what I was expecting because I'm firing dry, but if that happens in a live fire exercise, that click, no bang should immediately trigger my brain into reseat the magazine, flip and rack, and be back on target. Again, let's walk through that again. So I'm going to go ahead and point in, get my dry press. I'm going to go ahead and reseat my magazine. The gun to the side. The reason we roll the gun to the side is if there's a spent casing or something in there, it allows gravity to help us clear out that chamber. So I'm just going to roll my gun to the side a little bit, rack it real quick, which should clear anything that's in the chamber and bring a new round out of that magazine that we just made sure was fully seated, and we can go back on target. Now, if I do this a couple times in real life, if I've done 2 tap racks, okay, reseat and rack the slide, if I've done 2 of those in a row, there's something wrong with my magazine. I should get that magazine out immediately, put a fresh magazine in, and try that again. Okay? It's not uncommon for worn out magazines for the follower spring to get weak, and it doesn't push all those rounds up quite right. And if you have rounds that are just a little bit out of spec, they can jam up inside the magazine, and so you'll end up with a whole bunch of bullets that are stuck way down inside of the magazine, and you're never going to be able to get them out in the middle of a crisis. So go ahead, get that magazine out of your firearm, get another one in, and then go ahead and rack it. Okay? So that's a type 1 malfunction. Type 1 malfunction, click, no bang, point in, get that click, no bang, tap, rack, flip, click, no bang, so on and so forth. And you can practice that all day long because without a magazine, this is always going to reset your action. You're always going to get a click, tap, rack, and flip. Okay? All right. Let's talk about a type 2 malfunction. A type 2 malfunction is where there's brass high in the ejection port. Now, if you have training rounds or a spent case that you can use for this, you can go ahead and trap that brass or that training round inside of your ejection port so that your ejection port stays slightly open, about like that, on that spent casing or on that training round. Okay? But if you don't necessarily want to stick something in your ejection port, or you don't necessarily want it to be open like that, you can train for a type 2 without. Go ahead, point in, squeeze your trigger. At this point, the firearm is set up exactly how it's going to feel if you actually have a type 2. Now, yes, the slide will be back just a little bit for a type 2, and you'll have some visual indicators. But if you know that you're practicing a type 2 and you're just working on going through the motions of the type 2, this is adequately set up for you to go through the motions of a type 2. All right? I'm going to go ahead, point in on my firearm. Now, when I squeeze the trigger, I'm going to get a dead trigger, meaning the trigger doesn't move at all. It's already all the way to the rear. I'm not feeling anything. I've got a dead trigger, no activity. Now, there's several things that could cause that, a type 2 or a type 3 malfunction, and so we usually add in a look and move. Okay? So a look and move, you move off the line of attack and you glance at your ejection port by moving the firearm up briefly, okay? And then pointing it back down range. Now what that allows you to do is see into the ejection port or to see what's going on. Now because I've got mine set up in sort of an ad hoc manner for a dry practice drill, I'm not going to see what I would really see if this were really a type 2. What I would see is brass sticking out of the ejection port, what we might call brass high, because it's high up and out of the ejection port. But I'm going to pretend that that's what I see when I look at it and move. And so when I look at it and move, then I'm going to respond to a type 2 with brass high, what we might call a stovepipe malfunction. Something's caught up inside of the ejection port. I'm going to solve it the same way that I solve a type 1. I'm going to go ahead and tap on my magazine to make sure the magazine is fully seated, and I'm going to rotate and I'm going to rack that slide. The big difference between a type 1, which is just a tap and a rack, is I have to look and move to make sure that I actually have a type 2. Then I'm going to go ahead, seat the magazine, and rip that one to the rear. Alright? So I can practice a type 2. Let's do it again. So I point in, press the trigger so that I have that dead trigger. And now when I put my finger on the trigger and try and squeeze off around, dead trigger, look and move, tap, rack and flip, back on target, back on the trigger, and decide whether or not to shoot. Alright, so that's your type 2. One more time, get a dead trigger, there's my dead trigger, look and move, tap, rack, flip. Right? And I can work on that again as much as I want to with my unloaded firearm. I'm not wasting rounds, I don't necessarily have to set things up because I know that I'm working on a type 2. Alright? Okay, are we ready for a type 3 malfunction drill? Now type 3 malfunctions are incredibly difficult to clear. It usually happens when there is a round, either live or spent, that's stuck inside of the chamber, and another round is being stripped out of the magazine and running into the back of that round. So the slide essentially gets locked almost all the way to the open, but on a round that's jammed up against another round inside of the chamber. So in order to clear this, we're going to need to get the ejection port clear, get that round out of the chamber, and then reload the firearm. So what's that going to look like? Well, it starts with locking the slide to the rear. Right? So that way the slide is no longer going to be catching on any of the stuff inside of my ejection port here. It's not going to be holding anything in. So we go ahead, we lock the slide to the rear, we pull out our magazine. Now we get the magazine out of the way for two reasons. Number one, there's probably a round that's partially stripped off of this magazine that's part of our problem. If I get that magazine out of the way, it will hopefully get part of the problem out of the way as well. It also creates more avenues of escape for debris or spent cases or live rounds that are stuck in this ejection port to get out. They can now fall out of my magazine well as well. I'm going to get that magazine out of the way. Now if I have a backup magazine in a magazine carrier or in my pocket or somewhere that's easy to access, I don't necessarily have to retain this magazine, especially if I think that this magazine is part of the problem. So I can lock the slide to the rear and get that magazine out of the way. Now, however, if the magazine is my only magazine, I don't necessarily want to just strip it to the ground and leave it alone because that's my entire source of ammunition. Many people who carry for defensive purposes only carry one magazine, so it's good practice to retain the magazine rather than dropping it to the ground. Now the question becomes, how do I hang on to this magazine and manipulate my firearm at the same time? A couple of tricks here. If you have a place that you can put it, like a magazine carrier, you can stow it, but that can often be tricky and difficult in a high stress situation. A better option is, as you're stripping that magazine out, use the pinky of the hand that's holding the firearm to retain that magazine. Okay? That keeps the magazine close by, which is going to be helpful when we go to reload the firearm. With that magazine out of the way, we still have at least a round stuck in the chamber of our firearm. The loose round that was usually stuck between the slide and the back of the round in front is usually out of the way at this point, but we're going to go ahead and try and make sure that the chamber is clear by racking our firearm multiple times. So locked to the rear, I'm going to go ahead and go 1, 2, 3. Okay? 3 times is not a magic number, but it's what we usually practice to make sure that that's out. Now sometime during that process, I'm likely to see, feel, or hear something come out of the firearm. I'm not going to wait for that, but it's a good indication that when that happens, I'm ready to reload my firearm. So once I've done that, 1, 2, 3, I'm going to go ahead, index my magazine, put my magazine back in, and go ahead and run my slide. Now, if we're doing this in dry practice with an empty slide, you'll notice it locks my slide to the rear. So there's a couple of things that I can do at this point. I can go ahead and use my thumb to actuate my slide stop lever to load it, or if you'd prefer, to just practice this one dry without the magazine. Pantomime the motions of taking the magazine out, placing it underneath a pinky, rack, put a magazine in and rack it. You can pantomime that, and it avoids the confusion of, oh wait, I thought my slide was supposed to be closed and now it's open. So you've got a couple of options there. Personally, I like to at least strip the magazine out, rack, put the magazine back in, and then I go ahead and I stage my thumb on my slide lock lever so that as I run that slide, I know that it's going to close. So I've got my thumb on top of my slide lock lever, preventing it from locking the slide to the rear as I run that. Okay, let's put that all together. That was a lot of information. So we start with a firearm that has a chamber open, usually blocked up on a round. Okay? There's a spent case or a live round inside of my chamber. There's another round inside of my magazine that's trying to get up into my chamber. So I'm going to go ahead and point in. If you have a Glock or something with a trigger safety, you may have to squeeze your trigger in order to get it to seat well. The trigger safety on a Glock holds the trigger out a little bit. So squeeze that so that you have that dead trigger, which is what you would have in a normal Type 3 malfunction scenario. I'm going to go ahead and point in, and I'm going to start to squeeze on that trigger. I'm going to notice I have a dead trigger. Much like the Type 2, I'm going to look and move, because this dead trigger is the same symptom that I have with a Type 2 and a Type 3. So I go ahead and I squeeze on that trigger a little bit. I don't get anything. I've got a dead trigger, so I'm going to go ahead and look and move. Now when I look this time, rather than seeing a bullet sticking out or a case kind of sticking out the side, brass high, which would be indicative of a Type 2, what I'm going to see is brass way down low inside of the ejection port, usually right on top of where the magazine is. When I'm doing this dry, all I'm going to see is my magazine follower, but I'm going to pretend that I'm seeing brass low. So I see that, and I go ahead and move into my Type 3 malfunction clearing, which involves locking the slide to the rear, strip and retain, rack, insert, rack, back on target. Right? Now as I did that, I was noticing that my grip on this particular firearm, and you guys probably saw this, here's my chamber. As I was doing that, I put my hand right here. And what you may notice is that that's completely covering my ejection port, which means that anything that I'm trying to get out of my firearm is going to get blocked by my fingers. This is why it's a great idea to do dry practice of these particular skills, because you'll start to notice things that won't actually work. And if you're trying to do this during live fire, you may not have the time to think through those types of situations. So again, I was putting my hand here, which is covering my ejection port as I'm doing that rack. What I need to do is move my grip just a little bit further back and make sure that my hand is out of the way of that ejection port. Okay? So let's go ahead and walk through that one more time, doing it right this time, hopefully. All right, trip my trigger, go ahead and point in. I get a dead trigger. I look and I move. I lock my slide to the rear. I eject and retain my magazine, grabbing the slide close to the rear, 2, 3. Then I'm going to go ahead and reload, reinsert my magazine, rack my slide back on target, decide whether or not to shoot. Alright, then I can go ahead and set that up again, trip my trigger, point in, look and move after I feel that dead trigger, lock the slide to the rear, strip and retain, rack, insert, rack my slide, and I'm right back on target on my sights. Okay? So the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 malfunctions are good to try and practice dry. And you can do them with or without magazines in the firearm. It's oftentimes easier to practice going through the motions without the magazine. Though the Type 3, it helps because part of that malfunction clearing is actually manipulating the magazine in and out of the firearm. So it's good to do it with a magazine, but not entirely necessary to do with a magazine. So there we go. We've just worked through several of the malfunctions that you're going to do with a firearm. Remember, a Type 1, click with no bang. You're going to tap, flip, and rack. A Type 2, dead trigger, look and move. You see brass high. Same as the Type 1, you're going to seat the magazine, roll it, and rack that slide to get anything out of the way, get a new round into the chamber. Type 3, You're going to get that dead trigger. You're going to look and move. You're going to see brass low in the ejection port, way down on top of that magazine. You're going to lock the slide to the rear, strip and retain that magazine, rack, rack, rack 3 times, insert the magazine, rack once more to reload the firearm, back on target. Those are your 3 malfunction drills. So there's another few things that you can work on with dry practice to get your skills better so that you can respond reflexively to whatever your firearm does or doesn't do correctly.